My name is Bart Thurber. I'm the Hendricks Bass Director at the Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center here at Vassar College. It's very much a privilege for me to be a part of the ModFest and for the Art Center to participate this year. So thanks especially to Tom Pacio, who's been such a great colleague throughout this. You're in for a real treat. We have a number of speakers this afternoon, beginning with Dr. John Murphy, the Philip and Lynn Straus Curator, Prints and Drawings, who will be joined also by Professor Adedoyin Tariba, here an assistant professor in the art department, urban studies at Vassar College. And they'll be joining us in just a moment. Then afterwards, we have three students. We have Ida-Rose Chabon, who's a sophomore, class of 2024, and she'll be reading poetry by Edna St. Vincent Millay. Jens Astrup, who's a senior, will be reading Langston Hughes. And then finally, Gabi James, also a senior, reading Joy Harjo. Specifically, we're going to start off with John Murphy and Adedoyin Tariba. Their talk is entitled The City in American Impressions. And this is part of our concluding event, really, for what's been a remarkable exhibition opened up several months ago. Tomorrow's the last day. For those of you who are interested in coming by for a last-minute view, it'll be on view from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. on Sunday, February 6th, which is the last day. The exhibition seeks to identify some of the amorphous and often conflicting allegorical representations of the United States from the colonial era to the present day, as mirrored in a chronological survey of the art of printmaking in America. So beginning with our first speakers, as I mentioned, Professor Adedoyin Tariba is Assistant Professor of Art and Urban Studies here at Vassar College. He is an architect, an artist, an historian of modern and contemporary architecture and urbanism. He offers courses on the experience of architecture and space in the modern era, critical regionalism and architecture, modern and contemporary architecture in West Africa, and intersections between industrial design and modern contemporary architecture. We're also joined by John Murphy, who, as I mentioned, is the Philip and Lynn Straus Curator of Prints and Drawings here at the Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center. He just arrived in late September of this past year. And before that, for 3 years, he was the Hohen Curatorial Fellow for Prints at the University of San Diego. As a graduate student at Northwestern University, he curated an exhibition at the Block Museum of Art of American prints from the 1930s. So he has a particular affection for the works that he and Doyan will be discussing today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to them. Thank you very much.
Bart, for that introduction. Thanks also to Tom Pacio for all the great organizing of the ModFest activities this week, and to Mary Kay Lombino for helping us make this transition to a virtual format. And thanks to Doyan for joining me for this conversation. Really appreciate your time, Doyan. Here's a shot of us together in the galleries. Wish we could be in the galleries with everyone today, but given the circumstances, hopefully this format will have some of its own advantages and still be a good prompt for conversation around this fascinating exhibition that was curated by Calvin Brown, a recently retired curator from Princeton. And just before Doyan and I get into the conversation about images of the city specifically, I just wanted to lay out a little context for how the show is organized. And it really opens in this first gallery with allegorical landscapes. The show generally is very concerned with how the United States is symbolically represented in these conflicting and often not coherent ways of seeing the country. But he's seeing it through the lens specifically of printmaking and print culture. And the United States has always been insatiable for images and prints. So carrying that story forward from these steel engravings after Hudson River School painters like Thomas Cole that are representing the country as this sort of utopian city on the hill. I think you can see this floating vision of the city in the distance. So we'll see how the city is represented in visual culture, specifically in the 1920s and the 1930s. So Doyen and I are going to spend the majority of our conversation today in this second gallery. So as you move from the first gallery dealing with landscape into the second gallery that deals with urbanization, modernization in the city, we are going to think about how artists like Edward Hopper and Louis Lazowick are offering very conflicting perspectives and points of view in representing this new experience of the modern world, a world of skyscrapers and urbanization. And I think this comparison struck Doyen, you and I, when we were in the gallery together, this sort of from Edward Hopper to Lazowick. I think you span the gamut in a way of these different responses. Edward Hopper's Night Shadows on the left, Louis Lazowick's Through Brooklyn Bridge Cables on the right. One vision of the city as sort of bleak and alienated and isolated, and then this image on the right, much more sort of triumphalist and celebratory image. So Doyen, as we sort of begin, I was curious to hear your thoughts about how Lazowick here is representing the city, very different from Edward Hopper's. Are there kinds of ways of thinking about the city that you think Lazowick is putting forward here? What's your response to these two lithographs?
Well, John, it's a pleasure to be having this conversation with you, and good day to everybody. So just to go specifically to respond to your question, as I look at these two images, what they evoke in my mind are conversations in architectural discourse that were happening at the turn of the 20th century. You had architects like Le Corbusier, who likened architecture to a machine. There was such a feeling that technology was going to spearhead an architecture of the future. And when I look at the Hudson Bridge on the left-hand side, there's such a celebration of technology and mechanics, such technology and mechanics became the architectural form par excellence. The Futurist Manifesto that was written in the early part of the 20th century celebrated pipes. Marinetti, the author, likened pipes to snakes. And so in these two images, there's this unbridled passion and celebration for technology. With Lazowick, for instance, there's this massing of these buildings. Notice how the buildings are devoid of any, it's just really a celebration of forms. And so that's what comes to mind. Both of them just evince what was at the time a celebration of technology, with the skyscraper, right? The ability to create multiple stories and to even touch the heavens, so to say, through massing, creating materials like steel that could erect buildings taller than ever before. So that's what comes to mind.
Yeah, and I mean your point, Diane, is so well taken too, because Lazowick, he was an immigrant. His family moved from what's now Ukraine, what at the time was the Russian Empire in the early 20th century, and you almost get this sense of the immigrant experience coming to the United States and being sort of overwhelmed and struck by the majesty and power of this new rising city. And you mentioned touching the heavens. There's this figure here who's repairing the cables on this bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge, this symbol of modernity, soaring into the sky, haloed by the sun, one with the sky and with the skyline. these soaring airplanes beyond the Hudson Bridge, which interestingly enough was still under construction at the time. You see some scaffolding up here. It wasn't to open, I think, for another few years. And so there's this sense of the city in development, this process of growth that's happening. And this tree here in comparison to the bridge, I find very, very poignant. And you feel as though Lozowick wants us to see this as maybe the new nature, the new world in which we live. I was struck by the comparison with one of the great paintings we have at the Loeb, this Georgia O'Keeffe painting of the East River. They belong to sort of the same moment, the precisionist moment in American cultural history, interest in the city and factories and bridges and silos. But what do you see when you look at this comparison, Doyen?
Yeah, this is fantastic. So just to return to what I said about massing, the almost the way that on the right-hand side in Lozowick's image, the architecture, there's this sort of conglomeration of the architecture to give just an awe-inspiring effect. You see a conglomeration on the left-hand side in Georgia O'Keeffe's East River. And let me just say something about that, because there's a way in which this conglomeration in both images almost approach sculpture to the extent where sculpture and architecture become one. There's hardly a boundary between the two of them. And in a class just literally a few days ago, in a class I'm teaching this semester called Frozen Music Fluid Architecture, the students and I read a text called Experiencing Architecture, where the author makes the what I think is a remarkable point, that if one were to be in a plane and look down at New York City and look at all the skyscrapers look like sculptures, they look like boxes. And it's only when you go down to the ground level that the sculptures become architecture. Those boxes become buildings.
Wow.
And it seems to me anyway, especially in Georgia O'Keeffe's work, that these buildings look like sculpture. They look like boxes. There's a sense of abstraction there, because it's a bird's eye view of East River that is only resolved, only becomes architecture as you get to the ground level. Yeah. So that conglomeration, that massive, right, that makes it look like sculpture, I think is common to both East River on the left-hand side and Lozowick's work on the right-hand side. And I think it adds, and I'll just stop here, I think it adds to the awe-inspiring effect, right, of the new, of an architecture of the future.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's so great, the comparison with sculpture and architecture, especially the way Lozowick frames our view of the skyline through these cables that become this sort of rectilinear frame for seeing this skyline as this sort of work of art beyond. The relationship between Lozowick's sort of social beliefs, you'd mentioned, Doyen, at the beginning of the conversation, that's interested in technology and modernity in the future. I just want to mention quickly that he'd written in the mid-1920s a book on modern Russian art, one of the first monographs in English on the work of Elizitsky and Rodchenko and the constructivists and the suprematists, and he was a committed communist. So he's not celebrating the city as a site of capitalist enterprise and industry, but the technology itself that, in his convictions and in his belief, will and should be appropriated by the masses, by the proletarians. So technology and industry is good for its own sake, but in his view, it's being misused under the sort of capitalist regime, but will realize its full potential in this socialist future, which I think is one of the reasons you see these celebratory images of the city made by a committed communist. to sort of switch gears a little bit from utopia to dystopia, I think we go from Lozowick's euphoric, celebratory images, triumphalist of the modern city, to something very, very different. And when we were together in the gallery, Doyen, I think you were struck by Hopper's image of the city as being related particularly to film noir, right? Did you want to speak a little bit about kind of what you saw when you were looking at Hopper's etching?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to pick up on that, like you said, the sort of unbridled celebration of technology leads to something else. And, one of the things when I saw Hopper's piece in the gallery, I thought of was, just two things. I thought of Orson Welles' The Third Man, and the way that this just replicates, certain scenes from The Third Man. And, you see that here is just a remarkable resemblance. But I was also thinking of the essay called The Metropolis and the Mental Life by the German sociologist Georg Simmel, and the way that in that essay, he diagnosed the way that the massing of a city, the architecture itself causes a human being to try and assert its individuality, that it's almost as if the city becomes a stage of contestation where the individual doesn't want to be swallowed up by the massing. And I think you can see this in the small size of the figure, right? The man in this case, in both Hopper's image, but even in this wonderful still from The Third Man. It's as if the architecture is brooding.
Yeah.
Right. And it's really sort of almost in a stern kind of way. And I think part of the dystopia, John, that you mentioned, the architecture in cities and the way that architecture, large structures frame, frame or even envelope certain individuals, asserting their diminutude, right? I think really adds to the dystopia. It's the language of dystopia. And, the promise of technology makes way for the language of dystopia. So that's what I would say. I mean, of course, in both cases, the monochromatic flavor of these just accentuate. So they accentuate the dystopia. So there's the brooding architectural forms that also are just really massing. You don't see a lot of details in both, but also the monochrome itself, the dark, the hues and all of that add to that.
And I think that incredible bird's eye perspective that the city allows, right? For the first time, you're able to look down from this sort of vertiginous or dizzying perspective and see these figures so diminished and so dehumanized. We're seeing them both from the back. There's no particular features. As you said, the architecture too feels like it has this sort of anonymous massiveness to it that is swallowing these figures up. So film noir, for me, I always think of this kind of existential, the loneliness of the city, the alienation of the city. So we're in a completely different visual realm here, and an existential realm from Lozowick's soaring worker in the heavens. Now we're sort of down and swallowed by our surroundings. I think even the fact that Hopper is making this as an etching as opposed to a lithograph, even the quality of the texture of the image itself. In Lozowick, it's that beautiful velvety, almost kind of charcoal or pencil, the agitated lines of Hopper's etching, that incredible raking shadow of the street light or the lamp that this figure is about to cross, that sort of bisects the image, just gives such a sense of anxiety and uncertainty, and it becomes something of a trope. I also pulled this still from Citizen Kane, similar, the vertiginous sort of bird's eye view. Different context here. This is in Charles Foster Kane's after his death, the Xanadu, right? The great palatial pile that Kane lives in isolation. And I think in the gallery, you'd mentioned there shots too of Kane's mistress, who then becomes his wife, right? Susan, and she's also this little figure kind of surrounded by the enormity of the architecture.
Yes. Yes. I mean, I think there are many things I could say, just about the relevance of Citizen Kane here, because in moments in the film, there are scenes where, Charles Kane's wife is all by herself in this just incredible, space. Even the fireplace is bigger, right, than her in terms of height and all of that. And there's such emptiness and bleakness in the space. But this, like you rightly alluded to, this is one of the last moments in the film. And it almost takes the viewers by surprise because, Charles Kane had accumulated so much and you didn't really see all of this, right, until the end, after his death. And so Xanadu, the castle, was populated with things much more than, much more than we had, seen beforehand in the film. And I think that is not an insignificant point because, he was incredibly lonely, right, in this space, in this very, very big space. And, my sense is that the acquisition of things, sort of where it's, I'm giving a psychological reading here where, where him trying to sort of, fight his loneliness, with his wife. But I mean, from an architectural standpoint, what you see on the right-hand side are boxes, right? They're boxes of things that he gleaned, and they do, to go back to what we said about massing, right? And the way that massing of architecture in the city engenders a kind of loneliness. We see that sort of massing, architectural massing here as well. And so they speak to the loneliness and the way he was trying to acquire things to sort of fight that loneliness. So I wanted to say that.
I love that, Doyen, too, because I hadn't realized until you said that the way that in this still you see that this is almost a kind of city of things, of accumulated objects, and the loneliness of a figure who's surrounded by these inanimate goods that are ultimately sort of meaningless after death, and the mystery of the word rosebud, the mystery of Kane buried somewhere here, in this pile of objects. And it gets to, I'm sure, what's a major concern for architects today. I mean, it always has been, but the city as a phenomenon, 5,000 years old, but urbanization at the scale that we're experiencing it today is relatively new. So Edward Hopper making Night Shadows in 1920, I think it was around the first time in the history of the United States, right at that moment, that more people lived in cities than lived in rural communities. So that switch from a predominantly rural agrarian agricultural economy to a urban industrial technologically infused society was, I mean, Hopper is right at that pivot point, and film noir is right at that pivot point where there's a question of how can architecture serve human needs and human communities and not contribute to the experience of the modern world as being one driven by consumerism and accumulation that, as we see in this still from Citizen Kane, can then contribute to a sense of sort of loneliness and isolation. And I'll pull in here this great painting at the Museum of Modern Art. I thought of Zimmel when you were mentioning the sociologist, Doyen, because if I remember from that essay too, he talks about the city is a curious place where you're surrounded by people, and yet there's an acute kind of loneliness that happens. So I think this painting is almost the perfect representation of that experience of being in a crowded movie theater. Hundreds of people here, however many. My experience from Chicago being on the subway, for example, and you're crushed. I mean, you're just crushed with people, and yet we're all, listening. We have our headphones on. So there's this weird disorientation that happens when you're surrounded, and yet there's an acute kind of loneliness that can still happen.
Yes. I think that's a great way you put it. Just sort of, the loneliness engendered by being in the midst of, just a lot, whether it's architecture or even people, but also I think that with the New York movie, it predates, there's a scene in The Third Man where, the girlfriend of the antagonist is in her apartment, right? And it's a lush apartment. I'm thinking now of just the lush decoration you see in this painting, and there's something similar. There's something similar going on there. So I just wanted to sort of.
No, I love that comparison, and it feels like the aesthetic experience of the city too. And then the film noir and Hopper's influenced by German Expressionist cinema, and then Hopper's paintings influenced film noir. I just mentioned this painting, Nighthawks. I enjoyed spending time in front of it when I was at the Art Institute of Chicago. I was thinking about architecture because someone pointed out to me at some point that this is a sort of mysterious space, this diner on the corner, where you don't really have an obvious entrance or exit. How do you get into this diner? How do you get out? I mean, there's an interior door that looks more like it goes to the kitchen back here. This feeling of a kind of fishbowl, the experience of a sort of voyeuristic ability to be someone standing on the outside of this diner, looking through this glass at the figures who, even though they're together, again, in this simul-esque kind of way, also seem very isolated from one another. So I just bring in Nighthawks as an example of that. It kind of goes to the larger question of this sense of disorientation and the sense of dislocation, even in images. And I think Martin Lewis, I use him here as an example of almost splitting the difference between Edward Hopper and Lozowick, because there's something ennobling, I think, in his image of these workers, these arc welders at night. We're in the middle of the New Deal response to the Great Depression. This kind of imagery is circulating of workers who are contributing to building up the city. And yet the city is as a nocturnal space, to a space of the underground, like you see the sewers in The Third Man, these incredible play of light and shadow, this chiaroscuro you get of these sort of rays of light silhouetting these figures that almost feel like what Wells was doing in some of the shots from Citizen Kane. Was that an aspect of the conversation you were having around noir, Doyen, was sort of night and the nocturnal and a different experience of space that has to do with these temporalities?
Absolutely, because I think in some ways the use of the idea of night does something to the architecture where it obscures it but gives it a sort of mood, and you see, especially, one can't help but think that something sinister is happening. Especially in The Third Man still you have on your upper right-hand side, where it's one of the most important scenes in the film. It's towards the end when our main antagonist is being chased by police. So architecture is really setting the sword for the climatic part of the film, and how, it's not just night, but it's this incredible play of light. Notice how the light is accentuating the brick nature of the vault in the sewer. But I also, just slightly pivoting a little bit, notice in all of these images, almost all of the figures have their backs to us, right? The only exception is the person that Citizen Kane is speaking to. And I think that is an important point in film noir, but also in what film noir does to architecture. There's a sense of, to go back to what you said about anonymity, there's a way that all of these figures whose backs are turned to us are anonymous. They're almost like pegs or pawns serving the city. In Martin Lewis's image, these are workers who are contributing to the glory, but also the glory of the city, the powerful, dark nature of the city, right? And so their backs, you can hardly see their features. The only person you can see is the person that Citizen Kane is speaking to, that, and even then you can't even really see his facial features. So I wanted to bring that up as just part of the film noir mystique, where there's an anonymity, right, that is projected on individuals.
That's associated with crime too, and getting away with things. And the city is the place where investigations happen because the Harry Lime, Orson Welles character, can disappear into the sewers and live this sort of subterranean life outside of visibility. And that kind of goes into, as we draw the conversation to a close here, the critique of the city. What Grant Wood literally called revolt against the city. He writes a pamphlet in the mid-1930s, and he's associated with this movement, regionalism, which from the point of view of New York modernists, like a Lazawick or a Stuart Davis, was backwards and provincial and bordering on kitsch. But he's celebrating his native Iowa and the people in his community. I think in your own work, Doyen, of this concept of critical regionalism, and is there a kind of critical purchase that the idea of regionalism can have? I mean, not to conflate the kind of regionalism you're working with in your own field with this specific movement, but I just wonder what that word or concept kind of means for you in your own work, and whether it helps us understand this relationship between city and country a little bit better.
Well, thank you very much. That's a fantastic question. And I want to answer that, I want to return to something, John, you said about Rosebud in Citizen Kane. Rosebud, I'm sure all of us have watched Citizen Kane, but Rosebud, is the last thing that, Charles Foster Kane says before he dies. And my students actually alerted me to this, that Rosebud was on Charles Kane's sled, when he was a boy. And it's, in many ways, it encapsulated his home as a child, and I think the best moments in his life. So home, I think home is an important, if not elusive, quality that engenders critical regionalism in architectural discourse, where certain architects who were tired of the mechanization of architecture, the way that architecture became uniform and was devoid of character and local color, started to draw inspiration from the home, from the region, to create architectural language that fitted in, right? That sort of became local and regional. And I think with Grant Wood, thinking about Iowa, it's as if, the city as triumphal, then leading to dystopia, ultimately leads to a kind of regionalism where the home of one's origin becomes inspiration, becomes a launching pad to think, to continue to fight for individuality, right? To, you know, to return to similar as well. So that is what you see. So this celebration of rural life, for instance, that you see both in March, but also American Gothic on the right-hand side, is now return is a complicated word because, you know, with people who, with architects who have gotten onto the critical regionalism bandwagon, a home is very elusive, and a return may be, in some cases, taking on some, you know, things from the local place and marrying that with more contemporary architectural, you know, concepts, construction, and what have you. So in terms of architecture, you know, people have thought about this in different ways. Marriage of the, you know, local and the universal, to use Paul Ricoeur's language, how to be local and how to be universal at the same time. So that's what these images come to, you know, so, you know, just sort of like a cry of the heart, right? You know, and so that's what I would say.
I love that. Well, and that's such a fascinating comparison to Rosebud. I hadn't really thought about that what Rosebud represents for Cain, innocence, home, childhood, all these things that he's lost over the course of his pursuit of ambition and greed and wealth and power. So nostalgia, it plays, can there be a kind of critical nostalgia that has purchase, or does it curdle into something sort of more insidious? And maybe that's a note to end on. Doyen, not to make you look into your crystal ball thinking about the future, but I remember you'd also mentioned Blade Runner in the galleries when we were together. I mean, this is a dystopian futurist, a neo-noir, a noir of the future. You also brought in Lewis Mumford, who's, I think, very interested, if I recall, in this idea of the organic city. How can a city serve human needs and community? Where do you see the city going in the future? Are we on a course to Blade Runner? Is there another way that, you know, possibly Mumford or other thinkers help point us to?
Well, that's a fantastic question. What comes to mind? You know, Lewis Mumford was quite critical of, you know, the city, produced that documentary, I think in 1939 or something, called The City. But where does the city go? It reminds me of another person who Lewis Mumford really held in incredibly high regard, and was the Scotsman Patrick Geddes, who thought about the city and thought about creating cities that incorporated nature, but also emphasized local cultures as well. He did things in India. He worked in India, planning cities in India for a long time. And but also one has to think about the Garden City and Ebenezer Howard, right? And so there are these thinkers, you know, and Lewis Mumford was a huge admirer of both Geddes and Howard. But there were thinkers out there who tried to think of ways that the city could unshackle itself from its mechanistic, technological, purely technological guises, to incorporate, you know, something that was both technological but also organic as well. And the funny thing is that Patrick Geddes was also a trained scientist, and he thought of cities in organic and biological ways. So perhaps that is the future. Ecological concerns remain an incredible concern. The environment, and so maybe, just to borrow from people like Mumford wrote one of the first essays on regionalism about, South, the Bay Area, architecture in the Bay Area. So perhaps a city of the future would incorporate, sustainability, but in a very broad sense, not only in an ecological sense, but sustainability also has to do with cultures. And maybe the city of the future has a way of incorporating environmental concerns, bringing in nature, but also, as Geddes tried to do, just propagate local cultures as well.
Yeah, and that would be a true flourishing of a positive kind of regionalism, a way of bringing in the local and thinking about how the human and the environment can exist in a more sort of harmonious way going forward. That seems like an optimistic note to end on, Doyen, as we've thought about this city. Thank you so much for your time and for your insight. It was such a pleasure being with you in the galleries, and a pleasure speaking with you here. So really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, John. It was so much fun, and thank you for being a wonderful interlocutor. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Doyen. And with that, I'll kick it over to Mary Kay Lombino, the Deputy Director of the Loeb, Emily Hargroves Fisher, and Richard B. Fisher, Curator, to continue on with the festivities and the closing events for American Impressions. So thank you all for joining in, and enjoy the rest of the program.
Thank you so much, John and Doyen. That was an enlightening conversation. It was wonderful. And there will be time for questions from the Q&A function in just a little while. So feel free to type those in. I see we have one or two already. But first, we're going to hear from students. So if you've had a chance to see the exhibition in person, or perhaps you noticed in the installation slides that John showed, there is some text, these various poems that are posted on the walls just above the art in the exhibition that are meant to bring some texture to the themes of the exhibition. So we thought it would be a nice idea to bring those poems to life by inviting students to recite 3 of the poems as part of our celebration today. So I'll introduce them. Our first poetry reading is by Ida-Rose Chabon, class of 2024. She's from Berkeley, California, and is an American Studies major with a concentration in art history and Native American studies. She's interested in folk art and hopes to study textiles in the future. I know she's already begun to explore some samplers in the Loeb collection for a term paper last semester. So Ida-Rose will be reading poems by Edna St. Vincent Millay, who is herself a Vassar graduate from the class of 1917.
These are First Fig, Second Fig, The Unexplorer, and Thursday by Edna St. Vincent Millay. My candle burns at both ends, it will not last the night, but all my foes and oh my friends, it gives a lovely light. Safe upon the solid rock, the ugly houses stand. Come and see my shining palace built upon the sand. There was a road ran past our house, too lovely to explore. I asked my mother once, she said that if you followed where it led, it brought you to the milkman's door. That's why I have not traveled more. And if I loved you Wednesday, well, what is it to you? I do not love you Thursday, so much is true. And why you come complaining is more than I can see. I loved you Wednesday, yes, but what is that to me?
Thank you, Ida-Rose. That was wonderful. So our next reading is by Jens Astrup, class of 2022, who's from Los Angeles. He's a major in Africana Studies with a correlate in English, and he serves as the co-chair of the Loeb Student Advisory Committee. He's also the student intern for Engage Pluralism Initiative, EPI, where he works alongside administrators and faculty to foster inclusive programming and a broader sense of belonging throughout campus. Today, Jens is reading a poem by Langston Hughes, the leading figure from the Harlem Renaissance and a renowned poet, novelist, playwright, and of course, social activist. And Hughes's work is also featured in the playlist that Christine Howlett, the chair of the music department, has created for the exhibition. So we will share that in the chat so you can listen to it later. So here's Jens.
Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain seeking a home where he himself is free. America never was America to me. Let America be the dream the dreamers dreamed. Let it be that great strong land of love where never kings connive nor tyrants scheme, that any man be crushed by one above. It never was America to me. Oh, let my land be a land where liberty is crowned with no false patriotic wreath, but opportunity is real and life is free. Equality is in the air we breathe. There's never been equality for me, nor freedom in this homeland of the free. Say, who are you that mumbles in the dark? And who are you that draws your veil across the stars? I am the poor white, fooled and pushed apart. I am the Negro bearing slavery scars. I am the red man driven from the land. I am the immigrant clutching the hope I seek, and finding only the same old stupid plan of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak. I am the young man full of strength and hope, tangled in that ancient endless chain of profit, power, gain, and grab the land, of grab the gold, of grab the wave of satisfying need, in Poland's plain and England's grassy lea, and torn from black Africa's strand I came, to build a homeland of the free. The free. Who said the free? Not me, surely not me. The millions on relief today? The millions shot down when we strike, the millions who have nothing for our pay. For all the dreams we've dreamed, and all the songs we've sung, and all the hopes we've held, and all the flags we've hung, the millions who have nothing for our pay except the dream that's almost dead today. Oh, let America be America again. The land that never has been yet, and yet must be. The land where every man is free. The land that's mine, the poor man's, Indians, Negroes, me, who made America, whose sweat in blood, whose faith in pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain must bring back our mighty dream again. Sure, call me any ugly name you choose. The steel of freedom does not stain. From those who live like leeches on the people's lives must take back our land again, America. Oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me. And yet I swear this oath, America will be. Out of the rack and ruin of our gangster death, the rape and rot of graft and stealth and lies, we the people must redeem the land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains, and the endless plain, all the stretch of these great Greek states. Let America be America again.
That was quite moving, Jens, really impressive. So our third and final reading is by Gabrielle James, class of 2022. She is an anthropology and urban studies double major. Gabrielle serves as the elected Vassar Student Association president and is also an active member of the Native American and Indigenous Students Association. Gabrielle is reading a poem by Joy Harjo, who was named the first Native American Poet Laureate in 2019. There she is.
This is An American Sunrise by Joy Harjo. We were running out of breath as we ran to meet ourselves. We were surfacing the edge of our ancestors' fights and ready to strike. It was difficult to lose days in the Indian bar if you were straight. Easy if you played pool and drank to remember to forget. We made plans to be professional, and did. And some of us could sing, so we drummed a firelit pathway up to the starry stars. Sin was invented by the Christians, as was the devil, we sang. We were the heathens, but needed to be saved from them. Thin chance. We knew we were all related in this story. A little gin will clarify the dark and make us all feel like dancing. We had something to do with the origins of blues and jazz, I argued with the Pueblo as I filled the jukebox with dimes in June. 40 years later, and we still want justice. We are still America. We know the rumors of our demise. We spit them out. They die soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabi. That was also really great. So at this point, we do have a little time for questions. Again, you can put them in the Q&A. And it looks like there is one question. Let's see. Actually, that one's been answered online. So anything else that might come through, we'd like to invite you to type those into the Q&A. I'll wait a couple minutes to see if anyone has questions. Comments are fine too. We'd be happy to read those out loud if you're interested. And in the meantime, I'm going to just announce a couple more of the events, the last two events that are happening this evening as part of ModFest. So let's see, there is the Language of Flowers, which is a projection in soundscape presented by Rick Jones, Vassar Light Collective, at the Bridge Building, beginning at dusk, and that runs until 10 p.m. And then, of course, the honorary Dee and Richard Wilson concert, an annual ModFest favorite, is happening this evening at 8 p.m. in Skinner Hall. So if you're in town or you're close by, there's still time to attend these events. You can check the ModFest website, which is just dropped into the chat for everyone to see. And let's see if there's any other questions or comments coming through the Q&A. It looks like all of those have been answered, and we're just about at 5 o'clock here on the East Coast. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending this webinar for American Impressions, A Nation in Prints. As Bart said, we have one more day and we're open from 10 to 5 tomorrow at the Loeb. So if you have time and you're close by, please come and see it in person. And a big thanks to all the participants, to Brandon Deichler for his tech assistance, always wonderful, and especially to Tom Pacio for organizing the event and all of ModFest. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy your evening and have a great rest of your weekend. Bye-bye.